Well, hello, Kim. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for having me.
It is awesome. I'm a little bit of a fanboy, I'm going to admit. So exciting to have you on the show. I think your book is transformative, and I don't say that about many books or any bodies of work. Your thought process on radical candor is so important, so needed. And so for the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to talk a little about what it is, and then how do you start to actually put it into practice? Whether you're leading a business, starting a company, leading a function, it's all about leadership and developing people. So, sound good?
Sounds great. Thanks so much. You just made 4 long, lonely years writing a book. Wow.
4 years. That's 1 year per quadrant, right?
Yes, exactly.
So for those that haven't had a chance to get the book yet, and please get this book, give us 60 seconds on, if you would, on just the premise, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Sure. Radical candor is really about caring personally about the people who work directly for you at the same time that you're able to challenge them directly. So that sounds kind of like apple pie and mom and all that good stuff. So let's take a second to think what happens when you screw up on one dimension or another. When you challenge someone directly, but you fail to show them you care, that is what I call obnoxious aggression.
Sure.
Now, I used to call this the asshole quadrant,
Yeah.
and I changed for a very important reason, because I don't want you to use this framework to judge yourself or other people. Use it as like a compass to drive conversations in a better direction, because we all make all these mistakes all the time.
Yep.
So another mistake that all of us make all the time is when we fail on both dimensions at the same time. That's when you fail to show you care and you fail to challenge simultaneously. And that I call manipulative insincerity. That sounds pretty harsh, but it can be just sort of like the false apology. It can also be backstabbing behavior.
This is kind of the asshole quadrant, right?
Yeah, this is even worse than the asshole quadrant.
Right. This is, I don't care about you, and I'm going to tell you what to do.
Yeah, and maybe you do care, but you're fixated on something else.
Right.
And but the place where most of us make the vast majority of our mistakes is when we do care. We do show we care about the other person, and we're so worried about hurting their feelings that we fail to challenge them directly. And this I call ruinous empathy. And if you are an entrepreneur, it is especially ruinous to be ruinously empathetic.
And isn't it true in all aspects of our life? Don't we do this in our personal relationships too?
Yeah, I often will give this talk and somebody will run up to me and say, gosh, I wish I had heard this 5 years ago. I wouldn't be divorced.
Yeah, absolutely. I can understand that. So going from ruinous empathy, someone who genuinely cares. Look, if you don't care personally, I don't know, you probably shouldn't be in the business of leading people, right?
That's probably true.
Right. So
although even, I will tell stories about myself being an obnoxious aggression and manipulative insincerity, not because I don't care, but because, I'm stressed out or whatever. So there are times when you're so angry with someone,
right,
that you're going to fall right down into the other two quadrants.
Sure. And it's situational, right? You might inadvertently treat different people on your team in different of these 4 ways.
Yes.
So presuming our dominant characteristic is that we genuinely care. We really do. We're well-intentioned. We care about the person probably too much, so much that it makes it difficult for us to challenge them directly.
Yes.
Then as I understand it, right, Kim, the premise is I'm not doing them any favors. I'm actually being cruel in a way by not leveling with them.
Yes.
And therefore, I'm protecting myself. I'm not really working in their best interest or advocating for them. I'm trying to make myself feel better.
Yes, and what you're describing now is sort of like the slippery slope between ruinous empathy and manipulative insincerity.
Yeah, right.
So I'll tell you a quick story that sort of illustrates this.
Yeah.
So I was building a startup. I had hired this guy. We'll call him Bob. I liked Bob a lot. He was smart, charming, funny. He would do stuff like, we were at a manager offsite one time, and we were being forced to play this game, this get-to-know-you game. And everybody was fed up with it because it was a waste of time and we were busy. But nobody wanted to be the jerk who raised their hand and said, this is a waste of time.
Yeah.
Bob was the one who was brave enough to say, hey, I've got an idea and it'll be really fast. Let's just go around the table and tell what candy our parents used when potty training us. weird but fast.
That's kind of weird but fast.
Yeah, fast, funny. For the next 10 months, every time there was a tense moment in a meeting, Bob would whip out the right piece of candy for the right person at the right moment. So anyway, we liked Bob. There was one problem with Bob, though.
There's a Bob in every crowd, right?
There's a Bob in every crowd. Bob was doing terrible work. We all loved Bob. He was doing terrible work. I was so puzzled because he had this amazing resume. I learned later the problem was he was smoking pot in the bathroom.
Oh, jeez.
Which maybe explained all that candy, but...
Wow.
Anyway,
oh, my God.
I didn't know that at the time. So I really liked Bob. The whole team really liked Bob. And when he would hand stuff into me, there was shame in his eyes. He knew it wasn't good enough.
Yeah.
But, and this is, here I'm going to kind of tease out both the ruinous empathy and the manipulative insincerity part of this. Because I liked Bob, and I genuinely didn't want to hurt his feelings, but also because that was ruinous empathy, but also in part because the whole team liked Bob, and I was afraid if I was too harsh, Bob would start to cry.
Sure. Then everyone would feel like you were ganging up on him, or you were...
Yeah, everybody would think I was a jerk, and I didn't want to, I mean, I'm human. I don't like to be considered a jerk, so
right.
I didn't say anything to Bob for both reasons. And this goes on for 10 months, and the whole team's having to pick up Bob's slack. And eventually the inevitable happens, and I realize I'm going to have to fire Bob. If I don't fire Bob, half my team is going to quit.
Sure.
So I sit down with Bob to have the conversation that I should have started 10 months previously. And when I'm finished explaining to him where things stand, he kind of pushes his chair back from the table. He looks me right in the eye, and he says, "Why didn't you tell me?"
Yeah.
And that was a terrible moment in my career.
You failed him. You failed Bob.
I totally failed Bob.
Yeah.
And then he asked another question, which was even worse. He said, "Why didn't anyone tell me? I thought you all cared about me."
Yeah.
So not only had I failed as Bob's manager, I had failed to create the kind of culture at the company in which everybody would tell Bob when he was going off the rails.
So many people fall prey to this, and while you failed Bob and you failed yourself, you failed the other people on the team because they probably, when you did part ways with him, they probably said, "What took you so long?" So everyone loses, right, in this scenario.
Yeah.
Right. The hard part is how do you begin to make that transition and take these baby steps? Because I have to imagine if you try to do it overnight, if I read your book and I say, okay, starting Monday, Radical Candor, first of all, people are going to be like, what the fuck? Like, who are you? Right?
Yeah.
Second of all, it's not going to be very authentic. It's going to be very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So it strikes me that one of the things that you need to do, if you're serious about doing this, is have this discussion with your team to prepare them, to set their expectations, to acknowledge that I have failed you or I could be a more effective leader before you just start to change your style. Is that an important step early in the process?
Yeah, I think explaining the idea to your team and using your own personal stories. I tell my stories in the book, but your stories are going to mean a lot more to your team than my stories.
Like, remember that time that I told you that project was great? Here's really what I was thinking, and I was too afraid. You know, I think you can be vulnerable.
Yeah, that's where you begin.
I was so worried about hurting your feelings that I failed you.
Yeah. So I think explaining the ideas to the team is really important. I mean, there are a lot of good things about Radical Candor. It's cheap. In fact, it's free to roll it out.
Yep.
It's fast, super fast.
Yep.
I'm talking about a series of 2-minute conversations that you have in between meetings.
Yep.
The problem with Radical Candor is that it requires enormous emotional discipline. And I don't know about you, but that's something that I'm short of. So I think the way to build up that discipline, to build the muscle, is by doing very small things on a regular basis. So the place to start, I think, after you've explained this idea to your team, is by soliciting feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Don't start by dishing it out.
Start by showing that you can take it.
Yeah, that you can take it, and not only that you can take it, but that you view it as a gift, that you appreciate it. And when you solicit feedback, I have some very specific, simple things you can do. So if you're listening to this podcast, the first thing I recommend that you do is come up with your go-to question. what's the question that you're going to ask? Because if you ask people, do you have any feedback for me? I can already tell you the answer. Oh, no, everything's fine. Like, nobody wants boss feedback. Nobody wants to give anybody feedback, but they especially don't want to give their boss feedback. So, and remember, when you're soliciting, radical candor is about both praise and criticism, but when you're soliciting radical candor, you're really soliciting criticism. So come up with your go-to question. The important thing about the question is that it sounds authentic. So I'll give you a few different ways to ask the question, and then you can come up with your own way. The question that I like to ask is there anything I could do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me?
That's a good one.
I like the question. However, I was working with one CEO, and she said, I could never ask that question.
Why?
The question, she said it sounded too sort of earnest for her. So she said, the question I like to ask is, tell me why I'm smoking crack.
Okay, but it works for her, right?
It works for her. Totally works for her. And more importantly, it works for her team.
Yeah.
And Andy Grove told me once, who was the CEO at Intel when Intel was on top of the world.
Not just the CEO. He was a legend. A leadership legend.
He's probably the godfather of radical.
Yeah, right.
He told me that he likes to, at the end of a one-on-one, after his employees have gotten through all of their questions, all of their agenda items, he would say there's one more thing. And I was working at Apple at the time, and I kind of looked at Andy and I said, did you steal that from Steve Jobs?
Or vice versa.
Yeah, and he got immediately grouchy, and he said, no, we both got it from Columbo, the detective show.
Oh, that is where that comes from.
Yeah. So there's a lot of places, just watch TV.
Yeah, right.
Come up with a good go-to question.
So come up with your own go-to question. This has to be very authentic, right? It has to be. So, but you used an example, Kim, where you said, is there something I could have done better? The problem is that leaves an out for the person to say, no, it was great. And then you didn't get you didn't get any useful feedback. The person could say, if I could have done one thing better in this meeting or one thing better on this project, what would it have been? Now you're kind of telling the person, you got to give me something.
Yeah, that's a better way to ask it. Not, is there anything, but what could I do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me? Show that you know there's something. So that's step number one.
So you got to start with yourself. Start by seeking feedback.
Yeah.
Again, it would seem like if you make too dramatic a change, your team's gonna maybe start to think you're becoming insecure or you're nervous. Like what happened to her? What happened to him? Should you tell them in advance that I'm gonna start practicing a slightly different style?
If it makes you feel more comfortable, you can. Okay. This is really about how you are in the habit of showing up with your team. For a lot of people, that would be a great idea. For other people, it's easier just to start asking this question.
Got it.
Start asking for feedback. But one thing I will say, it is so important and powerful as a leader to make yourself a little vulnerable. One of the biggest mistakes I see new leaders make is not soliciting feedback.
Sure.
Or thinking that, omniscience is a job requirement.
I'm CEO. I'm expected to know everything.
Yeah.
Right.
No, you're not. That's the good news. So you got to ask this question. Then you got to embrace the discomfort, right? Because the person is going to try not to tell you anything.
Sure.
So simple way to do that, shut your mouth and count to 6 in your head. And not like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 1,000, 2,
right.
1,000.
Don't fill the gap of awkwardness.
Yeah, because and that's a big part of leadership, actually, is being comfortable with awkwardness. It's a good way to put it.
Now, you brought up Steve Jobs, and this, to me, begs the question. I'm sure you've heard this a million times. What did he practice radical candor from everything that we know and we've read and studied and the movies and everything, and perhaps you met him? Or was his style more obnoxious aggression? I mean, it seems to have worked. Or is the answer just, you know what, you're not Steve Jobs, so you don't have permission to do that. If you can tell the future, you're allowed to do this.
It's a great question. So for my money, I'm going to give Steve Jobs, for the most part, radical candor. But there's a little section in the book where I talk about the perilous boundary between radical candor and obnoxious aggression. And that really gets measured not at Steve's mouth, but at the ears of the people who worked with Steve.
Right.
And I will say, if Radical Candor is care personally and challenge directly, there's no doubt but that he challenged directly.
Sure.
I mean, ruinous empathy and manipulative insincerity were not his mistakes. But I would say there's also no doubt but that he had an awfully close relationship with his direct reports. I mean, Tim Cook offered him his liver,
right,
and he declined the sacrifice.
Right.
I don't know.
It doesn't get much better than that, right?
Yeah, that's love.
I think part of the challenge, of course, I never met him, but I think part of the challenge for some is that I do get the sense that he cared personally, yet he was able to flip so quickly and fire people on the spot. When they did something wrong or did something that he didn't agree with, and perhaps it made others say, how could someone who cares personally care more about the product than about the people, or care more about the user interface than about their people? That very quick decision to change on that person perhaps instigated that fear, or people to think it was more aggression.
Yeah, most leaders wait way too long to fire people who
Sure.
need to be fired.
Sure.
Again, I don't think that was a problem that Steve had. But it's so hard to be a distant onlooker into these things. There's always so much more going on. Johnny Ive tells a really good story about Steve. He said that he was doing a design review with the design team, and the designs weren't where they needed to be. And Steve, was unambiguous in his critique of the design. And afterwards, Johnny said to Steve, why were you so harsh with the team? And Steve said to Johnny, well, why were you so unfair?
Yeah, why'd you hold back, right?
Yeah, did you think the designs were good enough? And Johnny said, well, no, I didn't, but I care about the team. And Steve shakes his head and he says to Johnny, no. The problem here is not that you care so much about the team. The problem is that you're vain. You care about whether or not the team likes you.
Oh, interesting.
And Johnny Ive is telling this story, and he shakes his head and he said, and of course I was terribly cross because I realized Steve was right. So I think that and you also have to remember there's a shared context. Again, I said earlier that radical candor gets measured not at your mouth, but at the other person's ear.
Sure.
And Steve was working with some pretty confident people, shall we say. And he describes there's a great interview with him in the Lost interview. And he describes the fact that your job as a leader is to let people know with no room for ambiguity when their work isn't nearly good enough, but also to reassure them that you have confidence in their abilities. And that's a hard thing to do.
It's a very fine line.
Yeah.
Before we start to wrap up, let's talk about something you brought up earlier, which is parting ways with people, firing people, releasing people, inviting them to pursue their career elsewhere, whatever you want to call it. When you begin to make the transition in your organization to radical candor, you're inevitably going to find some people that can't get there. They're so, I don't know, they don't care personally, or they aren't able to challenge, or they live at the intersection of the two. Is that just not a non-negotiable? Do you need to part ways with those people, no matter how talented they may be, no matter how great their sales numbers are, no matter how much everyone likes them? Would you say it's non-negotiables? This can be practiced, but I have to imagine at some point, if you can't get there, you can't get there.
I'm optimistic about human beings. I think I've never met a human being who doesn't care about the people they work most closely with, if they give themselves the freedom to do it, if they don't get so caught up in trying to be professional, if you give people permission to be human beings, it's hard to find. I guess if you have somebody who is sort of a psychopath, then that's another issue.
Right, but to your point about Johnny Ives, if they care about themselves more than they care about others, or how others perceive them, maybe they won't be able to get there.
I think usually if you show people that they're not going to be rewarded for being political, for example.
Yeah.
And if you create the environment, then you can usually get people there. But it is true that not is a fit on your team.
Right.
Either for skill reasons or just for cultural fit reasons. And I think it's important to let people know when they're not a fit, because they're not going to do the best work of their lives if they're not a fit. They're going to feel they're going to feel sort of awkward. So what I want to do, though, I know we don't have tons of time left. I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about not only soliciting feedback, but giving it.
Please.
Giving it.
So how do we practice that?
So the next thing that you focus on is giving praise. Focus on the good stuff. Not in a feedback sandwich kind of way, but a lot of us spend so much more time focusing on and fearing giving criticism that we forget that all of the discipline that you need to have around criticism also needs to be brought to bear for praise.
And a little praise goes a long way. Some people are starved for praise. They've had managers who haven't said one great thing about their work in the past year.
Yeah. And people often don't know what success looks like. So just remember, the purpose of public praise is to show the whole team what success looks like. You get so much more leverage out of public praise in terms of driving the right behavior and the right kind of work than you do out of criticism, which should be given in private by and large. And when you're giving both praise and criticism, just keep a few things in mind. Be humble.
Yep.
State your intention to be helpful. Do it immediately. Do it right away. The best feedback I ever got is in 2-minute conversations in person in between meetings. So do it right away. Do it in person if at all possible. There's a hierarchy of medium. Don't do it over text. At least use video conferencing.
Yep.
Praise in public, criticize in private, and don't make it about personality. Both praise and criticism are about helping people make a change. And it's really pretty darn hard to change your personality. So use situation, behavior, impact. In the meeting, when you said every third word, you sounded stupid.
Yep. Great example from the book. Yeah. Kim, it sounds so simple, but it's not easy, right?
It is really hard.
It is simple but hard. And I give a lot of credit, not just to you for writing the book, but for helping hopefully begin a movement. Because if leaders, no matter if you're leading 5 people or 1,000, if you're leading a business and you begin to bring this in, much like Jack Welch talked about, right? Candor. Yeah. Candor was a key theme for him back in the day at General Electric. It is unstoppable. How can people learn more about the book, get their hands on the book, and follow what you do?
Buy the book wherever you love to buy books. So it's in most independent bookstores. It's on Amazon, all the usual places. Our website is radicalcandor.com. And follow me at Kimball Scott. And I tweet a lot. So would love to hear from your listeners about how it's going rolling out Radical Candor.
Great.
Always glad to get some Radical Candor on Radical Candor.
I think we're going into a second generation thing.
Meta.
Yeah, very meta. Kim, thank you so much for making the time.